Hello. For my presentation, I wanted to find an animal-plant interaction that was based on a marine environment, since we didn't really get to explore this area in class. So I found that otters, urchins, and kelp have actually a pretty interesting interaction, so that's what I went for. This is the paper that I found described these interactions pretty well, and it also involved climate change and how that plays a factor into the interactions. It's titled Keystone Predators Govern the Pathway and Pace of Climate Impacts in a Subarctic Marine Ecosystem. And what researchers did was they studied these islands off the southeast coast of Alaska around the Aleutian Archipelago. This paper was published just in September of this year, so it's pretty recent. And researchers hypothesized that the decrease of otter populations on top of climate change has drastically increased the rate of destruction of the reefs in these areas. Just for a little bit of background, the researchers studied this red alga that acts as a reef builder specifically in these areas, and this alga is called Clethromorphum nerostratum. And as I said, it serves a reef building block. It forms these massive limestone structures that cover about 50 to 100% of shallow sea floors. And many different species use this area for living, and nutrients and kelp forests grow on top of these limestone deposits. And when these kelp forests are present, these alga deposits freely thrive. So as the kelp forests become damaged, the deposits in alga become damaged too. Typically this alga is pretty resistant to changes in the kelp forest, but climate change weakens their skeleton, increasing the damage of the grazing that's being caused by different herbivores. So the chain reaction that's occurring here is a little lengthy, so let me just break it down for you. Near these areas of Alaska, there has been an increased amount of whaling occurring, and in response to this, killer whales have been moving themselves into other territories, specifically territories where otters are present. And since killer whales are known to prey upon otters, the otter populations have seen significant decrease since the whales have been hunting otters more than they normally would have if there wasn't whaling occurring. The increased predation on these otters has caused their populations to dwindle. The decline in otter populations have increased the survival rate of urchins, which is one of the otter's main food sources in this area, making the urchins become hyperabundant. These urchins feed on the alga deposits and the kelp forests that grow on them, and can cause a lot of damage in a very short amount of time. This last picture here is actually a picture that was taken by researchers during their study, and as you can see, this area is very barren, and you can see the little green sea urchins that are still living, but nothing else has been living, and it just looks very bland and barren and not very healthy at all. To study these relationships in action, researchers used multiple different methods to help back up their hypothesis. So one thing that they did was that they surveyed these islands, and they visually monitored the impacts of the urchin grazing from 2014 to 2017. They also reconstructed the history of the grazing through grazing scars on the alga's skeleton, and they were able to reconstruct this history from the last 40 years or so. On these deposits, repeated grazing of tissues to a depth of more than 0.25 millimeters, which is below the alga's regenerative layer. So at that bite depth, urchins are removing up to 7 years of alga growth, and that's how they measured the repeated grazing throughout the last 40 years. Was they measured these bite marks and were able to determine how long this has been occurring and how long it's been an issue. They also, to study the effects of climate change, they put some of these algae deposits along with sea urchins and raised them in a controlled environment and changed the water temperatures and the CO2 levels and monitored how that affected the alga's skeletal density and the effects of the urchin grazing. At the very beginning of their study in 2014 is when they were able to reconstruct the history of these areas, and they were able to determine what these areas were like from 1965 to 2004, just to get a baseline before they started their 3-year study. With graph A, each line represents a different area, and the little orange-red rectangle, that represents the recent decline of sea otter populations, which they took from another study that was done on otters. And as you can see here, that with this otter population decline, the grazing events increased, especially with those first 2 areas. They increased significantly. With graph B, you can see that as the urchin's biomass increased, so did the bioerosion rate. So that kind of shows that urchins are creating these immense bioerosion events. These graphs are showing their observations from their 3-year study from 2014 to 2017. Graphs C and D are showing what they observed at the very beginning of this study. And as you can see in graph C, that there are very high lethal levels of bioerosion, and there's very little live tissue remaining, so that just means that the urchins have eaten away all of this live regenerative tissue, so that these colonies cannot regenerate. Graph D shows the maximum bite depths that they measured from the urchins, and as I said, to be considered bioeroded, the bite depths had to be 0.25 millimeters or more. But in these areas, the maximum bite depth that they found was 2.5 millimeters, which is 10 times the minimum to be labeled as bioeroded. So those are very deep, deep bite depths. Graph E is the excavation pits. The paper didn't really explain what those were, so I'm just going to move on from those. Graph F specifically shows the changes from 2014 to 2017. The very dark bars here represent their findings from 2014. The white bars show 2015, and the gray bars show 2017. And as you can see, there's a significant decrease in the alga reef coverage from 2014 to 2015. This could be explained from the recorded marine heat waves that occurred in those years. So that could also be showing that climate change and warming sea temperatures are causing these bioerosion rates to increase significantly. To further analyze the effects of rising seawater temperatures on bioerosion rates, the researchers cultured the alga and raised urchins for 4 months in a controlled environment, periodically changing the water temperature and the water's CO2 levels. They monitored the structural integrity of the alga and its susceptibility to urchin grazing. The 3 different colors here just represent the different levels of CO2 that they created, and with each different level represents the pre-industrial, which is P, modern, which is M, and the future prediction, which is F. Those levels of CO2. On both graphs here, the x-axis represents 2 different tested temperatures, which were 6.5 and 8.5 degrees Celsius, which is about 43.7 and 47.3 degrees Fahrenheit. As you can see, with increasing temperatures and CO2 levels, there's a significant damage being done to this alga. Specifically with graph A, you can see that as the temperature increases along with the increase of CO2 levels, the alga's skeletal density is dramatically decreasing. With graph B, you can see that with increasing temperatures and CO2 levels, the bioerosion rate is significantly increasing. So that can show you that both factors are playing a very big part into bioeroding these reefs and causing significant damage. One thing that researchers did not mention in this paper, but I think is very important to note, is that not only do these kelp forests and reef builders rely on otters to keep these urchin populations in check, but the otters also rely on these kelp forests in two different ways. One, these kelp forests attract the urchins, which the otters can feed on, and it provides them with nutrients and the food that they need. Also, otters will sometimes wrap themselves in these kelp to keep them stationary when they are resting or sleeping. So there's really a very strong mutual relationship going on where both otters and kelp forests depend upon each other, and in turn, these alga deposits are associated with those relationships as well. Researchers have predicted that in the next 80 years, bioerosion rates can increase another 17 to 39%. This is very dangerous because most of these areas are already severely bioeroded, so any more increase in bioerosion is going to do a lot of damage. And these reef processes are very important to the environment because they remove CO2 from the ocean, and they also provide nutrients and homes to many species that are also in danger. The conclusions that can be drawn from this paper are that otters are very important to these types of ecosystems, and they are indeed a keystone species and provide the right levels of urchin populations. They don't let urchin populations get too out of control. And two, we need to decrease pressure on whales to begin with in these areas to be able to increase our otter populations and in turn decrease our urchin populations. And three, we need to also focus on reversing climate change and the effects that climate change has had on these areas that is causing such an extreme acceleration to this destruction. I thought this picture was just really cute, but I have heard many people say that otters are very harsh to the environments that they live in and just completely destroy areas and can almost be seen as an invasive species even though they aren't new species. But I find that this paper shows that in these areas otters are actually very important and should not be wiped out, because if they are, the damage is going to be so much worse than if the otters were present. The first source right here is just the paper. The second source is the one that is discussing how otters hold on to the kelp when they're trying to stay stationary, and then the rest of them are just the images that I found that were not taken from the paper.